Hi, everyone. Welcome to what I think is our 10th conversation in 2022 for CHIWORK, the Symposium on Human-Computer Interaction for Work. I am Helena Mentis, your host for today's conversation. Today we have Lilly Irani from the University of California, San Diego as our guest. But before I introduce her, let me just tell you a little bit about CHIWORK. The CHIWORK series is weekly conversations with experts on various aspects of the future of work. The general chairs are Andrew Kuhn and Ora Scher. The technical program chairs are Chris Jansen, Neha Kumar, Anna Cox, and myself. We have a fantastic team of volunteers that create these series, and you can find out more about them and about the future CHIWORK sessions on www.chiwork.org. On the website, you'll find a link to register. If you register, we'll send you information about the talks and calendar invitations with links to the Zoom call. And this series is partially supported by the National Science Foundation. For today, we will have a 30-minute conversation with Lilly, which will include questions from the audience. And we do love to see you. So if you're in a position where you can turn on your camera, we'd love to see you right now. It helps us with that sense of community feeling. Please note that this session is recorded, but it will only record those that speak, such as myself right now. Please write any questions you have in the chat. We're going to be monitoring that, and we will call on you to ask your question when we open it up for general questions. And then after the conversation, we will stop the recording and have time for more informal conversations. So let's get started. Today's guest is Lilly Irani. Lilly Irani is an associate professor of communication and science studies at the University of California, San Diego. She also serves as faculty in the Design Lab, Institute for Practical Ethics, the Program in Critical Gender Studies, and sits on the Academic Advisory Board of AI Now at NYU. She is the author of Chasing Innovation, Making Entrepreneurial Citizens in Modern India. I believe that came out in 2019, and the book Redacted, which came out in 2021 recently. Chasing Innovation has been awarded the 2020 International Communication Association Outstanding Book Award and the 2019 Diane Forsyth Prize for Feminist Anthropological Research on Work, Science, or Technology, including biomedicine. Her research examines the cultural politics of high-tech work and the counter practices they generate as both an ethnographer, a designer, and a former technology worker. She is also co-founder of the digital worker advocacy organization Turkopticon. Welcome, Lilly. It is great to have you here with us today.
Thanks for inviting me and gathering these folks here. I'm really excited.
Excellent. Well, let's get started with a few questions that we've been able to put together for you. So you have been studying the behind the scenes affairs of tech workers for a number of years now. I personally was really inspired by your work through Turkopticon. For those who aren't equally familiar with it, can you give a little background on what it is and how it came about?
Yeah, so Turkopticon for about a decade was a website that Amazon Mechanical Turk workers could use to share information with other workers about how employers were treating them, whether the employers paid on time, whether they communicated well. And where it actually came from was I was working at Google in the early 2000s as a user experience designer. And my background was in computer science. And even at Google, I was seeing that there's groups of workers that had access to like all places in the Googleplex and the free food. And then there were workers that I would talk to who like over time were getting kind of more and more pushed to the margins or the hidden parts of campus, doing book scanning work. Like these are folks with like master's degrees from Stanford in some cases, and also sometimes people with, bachelor's degrees, sometimes PhDs in certain fields. So it was like really clear there was a kind of this hierarchical division of labor. And at one point I was on a project where the advertising engineers needed to sort out which ads had a violated content policy. And so it became clear to me that there's workers also in other countries who are there part of processing the kind of the basic ads that are being put on the platform, which are the backbone of the Google business. And I would never really meet these folks, and people wouldn't really talk about or think about, what it is that they know, what it is that they could be contributing. So I had this so from that experience and from the experience of other people I knew from computer science who were starting to work at search engine companies, comparing new and old search algorithms where they also needed human workers, like I knew that this kind of work was essential. And when Amazon Mechanical Turk came out in the computer science community, it was kind of being celebrated as this like innovative, magical platform that would enable computer science to do amazing things. And I really didn't know a whole lot about, kind of labor as a academic topic. I knew that my mom did various kinds of labor that were undervalued over, and like that was a kind of basic sense I had that it's not fair that this labor is being devalued and these workers are not being respected for their knowledge. So I was taking a course called Tactical Media in the art department at UC Irvine, and I started asking Turkers how they felt about their jobs. Like, I didn't want to assume what was wrong with it. And a lot of workers who responded to my survey said, that they have a lot of diverse opinions about what needs to be made better, but one of the things that really bothered them was the ability of employers to just unilaterally reject their work. Because what happens when employers unilaterally reject work on the Amazon Mechanical Turk platform is that the employer doesn't have to pay. So it's effectively a sort of form of wage theft. Amazon takes that rejection. It assumes that it's a signal of bad work done. So without looking at whether the work actually was bad, they drop the workers' approval rating, which can then cut workers off from access to other work. So that was one example of something that was really important to a lot of people who responded. And so we built Turkopticon as a place where workers could communicate about problems like that, the things that were significant to them, and help warn each other off of crappy employers. And I would just add, I think working on Turkopticon for 10 years taught me a lot about how much time it really takes to go beyond making software, bringing people together to make collective decisions. I think being in academia, in a field where you get paid for generating novel research problems or teaching, and not having any kind of education about how to organize collective deliberations and conversations, the kinds of things community organizers learn. All of that, I would say, really held Turkopticon as a project back for a decade. The other thing that happened over the last decade was that digital labor became a big topic. Now, then it became the future of work. People asking, what does Uber mean? What do platforms mean as a form of work? And for 10 years, I would be invited into rooms, there are workshops, conversations. Sometimes there would be company people there, foundation people there, NSF people there. I was invited into rooms where people were, government entities, companies, and academics were trying to make knowledge about the kind of platforms, digital labor, and the future of work. But when I look back and ask whether any of that actually made any difference to the working conditions of Turkers, unfortunately, I have to say the answer is no. And so I had, once I finished my book and did the things that academia required me to do to not lose my job, on reflecting, I came to understand that, those workshop spaces and making knowledge about work is not really, is not going to make, that alone is not going to make any changes. Organizing with people who want to see change happen, to figure out how to put pressure to get the right policies in place or pressure key decision makers, that's what makes change happen. And I think I think my personal experience was that for 10 years, I was kind of told, like, by making knowledge, you can make the world a better place. But actually, by working with the people who have most at stake, then you figure out together what kinds of collective risks you all are willing to take, and for which issues to really change the things that need to change.
That's really fascinating. I actually was thinking, when you first started getting into this work, were you motivated with this idea of sort of balancing the scales? Did you think, like, going into it, once you recognized that there was this opportunity or that people were being exploited, that you were like, and I'm going to change that?
I mean, it wasn't so much like I'm going to make this huge impact, but I did think that I did think that, okay, the platform policies are unfair, and then the software can provide some kind of communication mechanism that can at least begin to make a dent in the other direction. I also, six Silberman, who built this and designed this over 10 years and, maintained this with me, like, I think we hoped that as workers, I think we hoped that, the workers would kind of begin to organize around some of these more persistent issues. Workers already had community forums that they would talk to with each other. Like, back in the day, it was forums like Turker Nation or Cloud Me Baby. Now Turker View is a major forum. Hits Worth Turking for on Reddit. I think Turker Nation still exists as a chat room. So there are these other forums that we didn't want to replace those forums because we thought community spaces that workers design for themselves were really important. But after about 10 years, well, and I should say, like, okay, then Nilüfer Salehi, Michael Bernstein, Alia Khatib, Eva Ogbe, and I, a group of students at Stanford, and and Michael, we did a project called Dynamo, where we kind of looked at, okay, there's these community forums and there's Turkopticon, but it's really difficult for groups of people to come to agreements about what it is that they want to pursue collectively. And maybe social media can help with that. And so we designed this system called Dynamo that would let, we interviewed workers about, like, what is it that you feel comfortable saying in forums? What do you not feel comfortable in saying in forums? How can social media maybe organize the conversation to make it possible for people to stick their necks out, be brave, about suggesting things that people might band together to try to change. So it had things like you could submit an idea anonymously, but once the idea got a certain number of votes, then it could spawn a discussion forum for people to discuss it more in depth and figure out what they want to do about it. I think those experiences, like, it was a kind of this incremental process of trying to figure out what would enable workers to better come together and overcome what some of the communication barriers are to change things. But with Dynamo, it's a research project, and one of the problems with research projects is that it doesn't have continued funding for maintenance. I would say another issue was that I think for a lot of well-intentioned people doing work in this space with, like, Mechanical Turk, including myself, there's this feeling of, like, okay, workers need to be directly involved in the conversation. Like, let's go find a couple of workers who want to work on this. And we had like 3 workers that were contributing actively to kind of the design of Dynamo. But if those workers are not, if there isn't broader organizing happening where to me, organizing is when, you're not just speaking for yourself, but you have people who can speak for a collective. And, like, why can they speak for a collective? Because they're going and having lots of time consuming conversations with hundreds or even thousands of people to make sure that the issue is being framed in a way that, like, lots of people can feel connected to and lots of people can get behind. So when you have a couple of workers who are coming to participate in the Dynamo project, or are helping out with an individual research project, or speaking at a conference, one of the things that would happen is that, a broader set of workers didn't necessarily understand what was being done, or want to feel connected enough to it to stand behind it, or even feel like they've gotten to put their perspective into the design and deliberation that informs the thing. So sorry, I'm getting a bit far from your question of, did we think we were going to change things? Like, yeah, I think we thought that we would change the conditions of communication, and then that would change things. And so what's happened now is, in the last 2 years, I got a grant from the Open Society Foundation, and that grant actually just pays for workers' own time. And together, we've been learning, community organizing skills, but also, like, it pays them, the worker organizers, at Turkopticon, to go and have conversations, to hold forums, to figure out what formats work, to have, and then to kind of get workers together around the issues that they hear coming up over and over again. And only with that kind of actual support can workers have the space to collectively deliberate and make sense of, and kind of imagine and act on behalf of the futures of work that they would like to see. So at this point, Turkopticon is a worker-run collective group. There's a group of Tech Worker Coalition programmers who help maintain the software with the Amazon Mechanical Turk workers. Mechanical Turk workers are dedicated to much more than the software. They're dedicated to campaigning for issues that affect them. And I'm kind of, they need lots of people in their network who are willing to take direction from them and support them with various kinds of tasks like research, networking, explaining how academic requesters work, all this kind of stuff. So I help out where I can and where I'm asked. And that's and let's see if this is a better modality. I would describe this in short form as movement aligned research, like putting efforts into supporting movements that exist rather than trying to design something and then hoping other people will give you feedback or participate in your design process.
You touched upon something, and I'm reminded that we have a lot of students who join us at CHIWORK about how this was like a 10-year-long project that you were working on, but it's a research project. And I remember the story that you told. This was a couple years ago, so it'll be interesting if there's an update to it. But you were telling the story about well, something had to happen with Turk Opticon. Who was going to take it over? You couldn't maintain this thing. And you were in talks with folks at Amazon. And do you remember this story? Could you
I do remember this story.
tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I wasn't in talks with people at Amazon exactly. Like I didn't initiate. So yeah, Six and I, we've been doing the Turk Opticon software project for like 10 years. We knew we wanted workers, if they felt like it was worth it, to direct it and run it. And so we put out this kind of call and we said, hey, we're looking at either passing Turk Opticon on and supporting people how we can, supporting Turkers how we can in future operations of it, or sunsetting it. And so we put out this call for about 2 months. I think our hope was that people would come, maybe gather a group together and come self-organize. But the weird thing that happened was that someone from Amazon, like a product manager, emailed us because I guess they had seen it on our website. And so he's like, hi, I heard that you're looking at shutting down Turk Opticon. We'd like to talk to you about what ways we could support to keep it going. And on the one hand, I was really surprised, but on the other hand, not exactly, because there were all these stories in the community about Amazon kind of supporting certain, like working with certain people in the community, but it was never all that transparent. And also we had noticed a couple of years ago that Amazon would pass, when workers would complain to Amazon about something that had happened to them on the platform, like, hey, this requester mistreated me, Amazon would say, oh, you should go to a community website like Turk Opticon. So they were actually outsourcing their own responsibilities to keep bad things from happening to the website that was run by volunteer labor of the Turk workers who had been moderating that system for years, and me and Six. So that part was like, is that what your motivation is? And then so we went and talked to some workers we knew, like some people who had been involved in Turk Opticon, I knew had strong feelings about it, and also some people from other community forums that we knew, and Turker run community forums that we knew. And they were like, no, do not take Amazon funding. Because for them, taking funding from Amazon kind of, from what I understand, I mean, it would be really interesting to have them speak on this issue, actually. And I noticed that Sherry is the lead organizer from Turk Opticon, jumped into the chat. So I invite you if you want to step in, but just know it's recorded, Sherry. I think the way I understood it was that, taking money from Amazon creates this, well, it creates like an obvious conflict of interest. Like whenever people are looking at a software system or they're looking at an organization, to some extent they're dealing with like a black box. Like you can't ever fully know the operations of the thing, right? And so people are making guesses based on what people say, how they act, what public commitments they make, and who they're funded by. And so I think it's totally reasonable for a group of people to look at something that's Amazon funded and ask, okay, so are they going to be deleting things that Amazon doesn't want on there? Are they going to be deleting things about requesters that are really important to Amazon? Are they going to be reporting to Amazon about things workers say if workers report stuff that makes them angry about Amazon? So yeah, that getting funded by Amazon was something that people saw definitely compromising. And I would say in hindsight, it also kind of, it's a compromising easy button, because, you know, if you're not getting money from the, if you're not building money from the kinds of people who actually share the same values of your movement, then you're not pushing yourself to actually reach out and make the connections and really advocate for why those values matter and why people should fund them. Amazon definitely doesn't want, Amazon needs to run an efficient platform that runs well for requesters and runs well enough for workers. The workers do work for requesters, but Amazon doesn't need to make Turking good work for everybody, which is what the Turkers like Sherry, who organized Turkopticon, decided they wanted the new mission statement to be. Sherry, I saw you wrote something in the chat. Would you like to speak it, or would you like me to read it?
Lily, you caught me off guard. I was not.
I'm sorry.
I was coming just to listen and listen to others. I was wanting to just like, yeah, be like the silent person in the corner. And
I'm happy to respect that if you want.
No, but I will go into what I said in the chat. That's, yeah, I will answer that part about it's hard to trust Amazon taking control of the only platform source that Tucker's had as a voice of anything to combat the mass rejections or a crappy, you know, a way of surveys set up or anything, because Amazon listens to nothing that we sent them. Like, even as a personal Turk worker, not Turkopticon, if I would email Amazon even to this day, I probably would just get a random like form email response. And that's a big reason why, even back before I was involved with Turkopticon, I would have been one to speak up to Lilly, like, please don't take Amazon money. Because then, yeah, I mean, Amazon just has control of it then, and we have nothing. And yeah, so, okay.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful. I think for academics, something that's really common is for people to say, oh, well, this funding doesn't really affect the work that I do. I mean, there's contract research where it's like, you have to produce these deliverables. There's a lot of basic research funding or gift funding from corporations, and people say, well, it's actually given no strings attached. I can do whatever I want. But getting that funding, I mean, one thing that getting that funding does is, you know, creates the trust issue that we were talking about. Another thing that getting that, I mean, another thing that I ask myself is if somebody's willing to give me that funding, what conversations do they start looping me into that influence how I think about the problem? So like, if I'm getting funding from Amazon and then I'm having a couple of conversations a year with people at Amazon, should I be spending that time talking to people who can't pay me that I should be accountable to? Like, you know, I was running back when we were running Turkopticon, like, you know, Amazon Mechanical Turk Workers instead. And then the third thing I think about is, why is this thing that I'm doing helpful to them? And if they're finding it helpful and they're not finding it kind of challenging, then does that mean I'm missing something? And so I think that the answer was also like, Amazon didn't find a piece of software for mutual aid all that threatening. They actually found that it helps them outsource problems, and so that if they don't have to take responsibility for it, and by not taking responsibility for it, I think Mary Gray kind of said this, that, you know, that by not taking responsibility for it, they can say, oh yeah, those workers are just independent contractors. We don't provide training. We don't have to provide key infrastructure. That, you know, that just becomes evidence of the fact that that's the right category. And it's not for me to decide whether that's the right categories for workers and their distinct situations based on how much they work for the platform and different employers, and for them to kind of, that's something for that community and those workers to decide. But just to make it concrete, like, why was Amazon willing to fund Turkopticon in its old form? I bet Amazon wouldn't fund Turkopticon in the form that Sherry is organizing.
Sorry, I didn't mute so you could hear this laugh. I highly doubt that they would offer me funding now, Lily. Just saying.
But I'm really like inspired to like, I don't know if you hear the way that you talk about the workers and the responsibility that you take on to the folks that you're working with. You know, I think like most of us in our research, we strive to do that, but there's always opportunities for us to learn for what that really looks like, what it really looks to be an advocate, to be a supporter, and to actually listen. And to give folks the empowerment, but also not taking advantage of them for, like you were saying, for my research. I don't need you to be doing future free labor. I was wondering, like, so you just started the sorry about this, the Just Transitions Initiative. And I was wondering if that's sort of like a framework that led into this, like your idea about what it means to be actually listening and supportive of the workers.
Well, the Just Transitions Initiative, you know, that's just a community, that's kind of a community building thing on campus at UC San Diego. I have a couple of colleagues, Manuel Schwarzberg Carrillo, who's in urban studies, and Matilda Cordova Azcarate, who is in my department. She's an anthropologist who studies the way tourism functions as an extractive industry in Mexico by taking advantage of, you know, geography, the kinds of cultural knowledge that people have, and it kind of, you know, affects nature. And kind of we've been talking about Turkopticon a lot and Mechanical Turk, because I think that's something the Kai community is interested in. But I've also been very involved in San Diego in a coalition to get democratic kind of city council oversight over surveillance technologies. And for me, that's about kind of broader democratic control over the technologies that we live with, which I think is part of what's at stake for me, in making sure like workers who are most affected by Amazon Mechanical Turk should have democratic, you know, I don't know if they would want this, but like for me, like I would like to see a future in which they, you know, like those workers like have democratic control over the platform. And a lot of what Kai historically is like looked at is kind of people, minds, organizations, and culture. But, you know, when we talk about the city, for example, and smart cities, or even with Amazon Mechanical Turk, where you have these geographies of work where the platform can get workers anywhere, and that changes the dynamics of competition and collaboration. I think learning from fields like anthropology and urban studies can help a lot. But part of what we're trying to do at UCSD is just to create a space for researchers who want to do movement aligned research. So research that isn't going to communities in order to engage them and extract from them to write research papers or get grants. Research that researchers or academic workers who look for ways to kind of move the resources out of the university, kind of out of the professional middle classes, and into the groups of people who are working on the issues that they face as those who are most directly affected by some of these phenomena, like technological change, climate change, surveillance. Yeah, it's like just getting off the ground because it's been COVID, but it's a place for us to learn together, and to develop practices that help us kind of move the power to design and deliberate out of the university, and kind of give more resources and also authority to directly affected communities. And I should say in this sense, like I've learned a lot from other people's work. Like Roderick Crooks at UC Irvine organized a fantastic conference around data practices and Black social movements, where there were community organizers in that space, academics in that space. There wasn't a hierarchy of who knows stuff and who's applying it between them. Max Libron at University of Newfoundland has a lab called Clear Lab. Max is an Indigenous Canadian Métis person, and they work a lot with various Indigenous groups around creating knowledge about the environment that enable these groups to fight for sovereignty over waterways. And Max has a lot of protocols about, you know, this is how we interact with people in our lab. Like this is how we interact with people that we're working with, like outside the university. You know, sets of instructions that try to create respectful interchanges that learn from kind of history of academia as extracting from a lot of these communities. So we have a lot to learn on the Just Transitions front, but and then, yeah, but I'm glad that we have some of these folks to learn from.
Absolutely. And in a way, you're going to serve as sort of a conduit into our own sort of HCI communities for us to learn from you, because I think we could also learn a lot with regards to like how to do our research in a non-exploitive manner. I wanted to give a chance to just before we open it up for questions to talk about some of the things that you found in your book, Chasing Innovation. You tell this really interesting intertwined story about the narratives around Indian entrepreneurs and national innovation. So can you tell us a little bit about what you learned from that and how that maybe has led you to argue for taking leadership from the workers themselves?
Yeah. I think in terms of what I've learned, like there's a kind of a class, there's a set of learnings about class, and then there's a set of learnings about funding that I think particularly inform how I'm understanding, the work with Turkopticon, the surveillance work today. So Chasing Innovation was about these social entrepreneurs working out of Delhi who were middle-class people born and raised in India. They've been working in these corporate jobs that have, they were like English and Hindi speaking, mostly Tamil speaking, but they were working in these jobs that kind of put them in service of global corporations. And they got really frustrated at their lack of ability to include what was meaningful, aesthetically and culturally meaningful to them in their work. And so they started a design studio that did design, social entrepreneurship spin-offs. And at the same time, the Indian government had been for about a decade or more pushing on citizens and industry to do some of the things that the government used to do. Like, we need our entrepreneurs to go out and figure out, new healthcare models and new education models. The development can go from, so the responsibility of the state to an opportunity for lots of people, as one banker put it. And so in the course of studying these projects, but also and how they worked on the ground as the designers went and tried to talk to people, like let's take a water filter project that they were working on. Like they were going from like village to village, talking to people about their water. I got really interested in whose knowledge ended up really mattering and affecting the final result of the design project. And also, why was there all this kind of funding going to social enterprise and design projects, but going not to the directly affected communities, but to these middle-class designers going out of cities and, to research and direct the problem. And, a lot of that money was going to human-centered design. So like, this is the kind of thing where like even Kai people were being given authority to go in and deal with like water access. And it's like, I'm sorry, I studied human computer interaction. I don't know anything about water pipes, fluoride or chemicals, like what? And so in this water filter, and I think overall, like some of what I saw was that, there's like a long history, especially in development and modernization projects, of seeing kind of politics as the place where, that's where people fight with each other. That's where you have to appeal to kind of everyone's needs. And so in India, the first prime minister, he kind of saw politics as a place of squabble and expertise as a place of planning. And there's a planning commission that could devote resources in the way that these middle-class, highly educated planners thought was the right way to allocate things. And in the book, I argue that actually you can see design as kind of carrying that forward, except instead of having these government accountable planners who actually have funding, you have middle-class entrepreneurs who are like, well, I'm highly educated. When I hear someone in the field say that they're scared of this transformation, or like they're not sure they understand this, well, they might not understand. They might be scared of something that they haven't seen before. I even heard designers talk about something called the Steve Jobs method, when a couple of different people described it as, well, people don't know what they want, but they'll like it when they get it. I've heard this in the United States too. And so like writing the book, I was trying to highlight this way that innovation speak has of rationalizing a lot of like funding and authority going to middle-class people to kind of make these futures that then other people who are directly affected by these futures, whether they're like workers or people in this village who are getting water, we're supposed to take input from them in our design processes, but then ultimately we're the interpreters of it. So all this to say, like, I learned that human-centered design is a political process, but it's a political process that centers ultimate like authority and funding in designers and their clients. I would actually say in most cases it's really the designer's client, because like a lot of designers work for someone else who calls the shots. And so I think that's another, that I think there's a way that the book kind of set me up then to want to go work in more of a community organizing mode, where it's not me coming up, we or a small group of people coming up with an idea and then going and getting input and feedback from the people who would be directly affected as users, but rather it's going to the groups that are directly affected and figuring out, okay, like, you know, I used to be a tech worker who worked at Google. Like, I think that, you know, unequal tech labor relations were crappy and affected me in these ways. Unequal tech relations affect you in these ways. You know, how can we form a kind of solidarity that comes from an honest place of how this system we want to change affects both of us, well, both, you know, all of us. And then, okay, like, what's actually affecting you, and what's your priority, and how do I put the skills and resources that I have in service of that? How do you put your skills and resources in service of that? Like, coming together as equals that can call each other out, hold each other accountable, and recognize each other as bringing in different things. And then knowing that decision-making authority has to be shared in the collective rather than just kind of input. Yeah, I know that this conversation really, you know, I want to leave time for Q&A. So I'm happy to talk more about any of that, or, you know, if any of that was, you know, if there's things that, like, past projects you think that I could be learning from, I'd really love to hear that too. I see Michael in the room. I know Michael's been around participatory design for a really long time, longer than I.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I thank you so much. That's so interesting. I hear the parallels between what you're talking about with India and what we've seen in the US. Questions for those who are in the room. This is the opportunity to pop in. I've seen, for instance, I think it was Pranjal, yes, who had given us a couple of really good links to check out, and I appreciate that. Did you want to say a little something about those?
Hi. Yep. So my experience also goes in I have seen a couple of work happening in India and in IT companies of India, which does surveillance and we do not know our rights. So from that perspective, I have seen a couple of how platform do surveillance in India and how we could bring agencies back to the system. So I think Lilly is already aware about what is happening in India and my friend. So my question could be around, as we are moving more towards the platform economy, how should we think about bringing back the agency? What could be a couple of check marks we should think about?
In terms of agency over the kinds of digital platforms that are being launched,
Yes,
not only in India, but around the world. Yeah,
Yes.
so India, I mean, one of the projects I'm guessing, Pranjali, you're talking about, and hello, thank you for coming, is the Aadhaar digital identification system. I think India is actually trying to export this to other countries as well, and there's OMIDIAR funding, World Bank funding for this. I think one of my observations about the Aadhaar work is that a lot of times there's a lot of civil society activism and research around the problems of these biometric ID systems, but what I've seen less of is an attempt to work with very large social movements that, you know, can come to understand this ID as connected to their interests. You know, like with Aadhaar, you have like really powerful groups like Center for Internet, not powerful, but you have very like thoughtful, good researchers, like, you know, people at Center for Internet and Society, for example, or people at some of the universities that I know in India, you know, working on this issue. But on the other hand, you had the farmers' protest against financial reforms that would have exposed farmers to massive amounts of private market price volatility for their crops. And those farmers' protests were like hundreds of thousands of people going on for a continuous year. Like India politics is awe-inspiring to me for the capacity people have to get out and fight for something that they really care about. But I think it would be really wonderful to see the people who think about digital activism actually make connections with the political parties, farmers groups, and like explain like, okay, this digital identifier is going to allow for a tracking of information. That tracking of information is very much tied to preparing agriculture for digital interventions, for financialization, for insurance policies that, you know, are based on the data that's collected and authenticated to the farmer whose ID you collected. You know, I think that there are reasons for those movements to be interested, but I think it's kind of like my problem with the last 10 years when I was going to all those workshops about digital labor and I was talking about the ethics and the privacy and like the labor stuff and like, but there was nobody there to really demand that the people who are making decisions actually listen and reshape the project.
Thank you very much. So one of the takeaways is always how could we enable activism so that it informs the system to redesign. And that's where we do not encourage much, but yes, activism could help us to understand the unintended consequences or where could the harm could come from.
Yeah, and I think it's important. It's not just, it's definitely not talking about like us as researchers just becoming activists. I'm talking about going to groups that are already organized and affected and working with them, because I think it's important to work with people where, you know, they are able to, you know, have enough conversations to kind of know what the group needs, and also to kind of have, you know, hold, everyone needs to like hold each other accountable to doing what the larger group wants, rather than like us as academics going out there and you know, writing letters or getting involved in congressional lobbying or things like that. Because I guess like one of the things we have to be careful about is like, okay, we are all people who are probably in some respect like in a university producing knowledge as academics, and so like, you know, if I think about like Amazon Mechanical Turk workers, like one of the things that I've learned from them is like, you know, academics are their bosses in a lot of cases. Like they're working at the institutions that are doing all the like, you know, doing all the requesting. They're like, we're making our careers out, you know, we get paid to make careers out of writing our papers. So, you know, there's always the question of like, who am I accountable to that's going to check me when I have like all these unintentional habits based on my middle-class academic career that are actually not, you know, that are actually making it harder to do the work that needs to be done together. Yeah, I'm more, yeah. So I think part of what I'm talking about also will require us to be willing to have conversations in different ways. Like, you know, it requires us to like learn to get like yelled at by people who like, you know, been screwed over by academics, like a whole bunch, you know. It's like, it requires us to like sometimes be like, okay, this person doesn't trust me and I have to respect that, because, you know, even, you know, they have their reasons. Like trust gets built, you know, it's not about coming with a friend. Like as qualitative researchers, we learn to like build rapport with research subjects through chit chat, but this is not that kind of trust. This is about trust of like, why would I work with, like, why would I give all this time to you, like an academic, in an economy that like, where you have all these other things to gain institutionally, and I might just lose a lot of time that I could have, you know, like, sorry, like the people that I want to collaborate with or be in solidarity with, or like, you know, they have what they have in to lose is like their time, like the trust that others give them, their, you know, their ability to work unimpeded by middle-class professionals, if that makes sense.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Thank you for pointing that out, Lily. So we have another question, but I wanted to actually give us a chance to have free, open socialization time at the end of this talk. So I'm just going to stop the recording in a second, reminding those who are watching that they can join us on Twitter at CHIWORK Simp. And next week, we will be having Ding Wang join us on the topic of what happens when click workers become office workers, in search of the workers' perspective on data annotation. And thank you for joining us. Let's stop the recording.